This is Suchitra Vijayan joining us for the Polis Project's weekly dispatches series. Before we go into today's segment, I would like to flag two things. Today marks 2 years since lawyer and human rights defender Sudha Bharadwaj has been incarcerated. She was charged and under the UAPA law, which is a draconian law where citizens can be designated as terrorists without any evidence. It's also important to flag that there's been currently no evidence produced by the state or the prosecuting authorities against Sudha Bharadwaj. Another instance I would like to flag is also the case of journalist Asif Sultan. Yesterday marked 2 years of his incarceration. Again, Asif Sultan was charged under the UAPA, and in the last 2 years, there has been no, again, further evidence produced. And again, Asif Sultan was arrested for simply reporting on a case. Many international organizations, including the CPJ, have openly spoken about that. As we live through these dire times, I think it's even more important for us to document the ongoing human rights violations. Today, I'm immensely privileged to discuss an important report produced by the JKCCS, the Kashmir-based civil society organization, JKCCS, which talks about the ongoing digital siege in Kashmir. On the 4th and 5th of August last year, India unilaterally revoked Article 370. Along with it, placed Kashmir and 8 million people on a digital siege, silencing violently Kashmiris from their access to not only their voice, but also the access to internet. Joining us today to discuss this and talk about this is one of the authors of the report, Misbah Reshi, who's a law student at the Campus Law Center at the University of Delhi and a graduate. She's also a graduate from St. Stephen's College. She has contributed to various human rights reports focusing on minority rights in India and various violations in Kashmir, including contributing and writing and co-authoring this report. We also have Radhika, who's joining us. She's also a law graduate from the Faculty of Law in University of Delhi. Prior to law, she studied philosophy at Hindu College. She was previously a fellow at FSLC, and she's deeply passionate about constitution, technology, human rights, and art, and how they intersect. At FSLC, she looks at freedom of speech issues, internet shutdowns, and women in technology. Thank you both for joining us. I would like to start with talking about the report. Misbah, can you tell us a little bit about the report, how you came to write it, and also the difficulties of writing a report like this, given the digital siege in Kashmir?
Thank you. On 5th August, when there was a complete shutdown, which was unexpected. Nobody had any idea what was going to happen. So at JKCCS, which has been documenting human rights violations for a long time, it became important that what happens after 5th August also be documented. But particularly after the Anuradha Bhasin judgment in January, which sort of recognized right to access the internet in a very limited sense, we realized that there was a need to develop a framework where right to access internet was understood in a larger context, and to understand why and how it affects the lives of Kashmiris who were at that moment under a digital siege. Now, what we wanted to do was essentially identify the costs, the impact, the consequences that this internet shutdown had on everyday lives of Kashmiris. We wanted to document the opportunities lost, the disruptions that it caused in everyday life, and that is what happened, and that is when we started documenting and we started working on the report in January. But what happened was that in March, COVID happened. There was a lockdown, which is something that we weren't expecting, and that made things very difficult for us. So when we started working in January, all of us were in Delhi, and we were working on the report remotely. But the plan was to go back to Kashmir and do a lot of field work, talk to people, and document for the report. But since the lockdown happened, we weren't able to do that. But one of our researchers did go to Kashmir because everything shut down. Her college shut down, so she had to go back, and that's when we actually realized the real cost of working under this internet shutdown, where just communicating with her was a problem in the first place, where every day the internet wasn't working. When we had to share documents, it took so much longer for her to download them, to just have normal conversations on different platforms was slightly risky. So those things definitely were a problem when talking about organizational working. But also beyond that, and in collecting information, I think that we relied a lot on talking to people, which happened on the phone because none of us could really go there and do field work. But when we spoke to people, they were extremely helpful, and they told us everything that was happening, which is, I guess, also pent up for a long time because they weren't really able to um, tell the world what was happening, and this was a really good opportunity to put all of that information out there. So we had people really help us. But in terms of connecting information, one big problem that we did face was what we wanted to do was sort of understand how digital India sort of was affected with this digital shutdown in Kashmir, and we wanted to see the way in which other working of the government within the organization, how the government was affected with the internet shutdown, or how people were affected in accessing government schemes. So we really wanted to talk to people who were working on these things, but we weren't able to do that because people weren't willing to talk to us. So that was a big problem we faced. But in terms of talking to people, I think it was extremely helpful because people were willing to talk to us um, really happily. So that was some of the challenges that we faced. In fact, one thing was one incident that happened was that there was a temporary suspension in Bargaon, in Srinagar. The internet had shut down, and our researcher lives in a place that is near Bargaon. So she had internet, but she also didn't have internet. So at that time, for a few days, it was a situation where she was getting internet for some time, but she wasn't getting internet for some time, and it really gave us an insight into how fluid, or what exactly it means to have temporary suspensions or to have a continuous 2G shutdown. So just things like that.
Before I go to Radhika, we are taking audience questions. So wherever you're watching us live, please send in your audience questions. Radhika, I know that you guys have been doing a lot of work at FSLC about internet shutdowns. Can you explain what tracking internet shutdowns entail? What are the parameters and what are the categories that you use?
Right. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's great to be here, to be interacting with all of you. So internet shutdowns. The way that we look at internet shutdowns are that internet shutdowns are always government imposed. They're blanket bans. So it's not like if somebody's blocking WhatsApp or somebody's blocking Facebook, we will not consider that as an internet shutdown. An internet shutdown will be a blanket ban that all internet services are restricted, right? The We do not. So we have like a tracker which we have on our website, internetshutdowns.in. We got a lot of reporting there. If there are shutdowns, and if there is a mobile internet shutdown but Wi-Fi is working, people report through there, through that mechanism. Sometimes people ask their friends to report. We get like a lot of like that, oh, our Reliance is not working or our Airtel is not working. So that is definitely not an internet shutdown. It's always, or the way that we look at it, it's always imposed by the government. And so one really fascinating thing about shutdowns is that they're hyper localized. So even in a state, it's not that an entire state will be under a shutdown, as compared to like other countries. Like if you see it, like in Belarus, the recent shutdown, the entire country was shut. So in India, what happens is a very hyper localized shutdown. Like a region will be shut, a region will be cut down. Like in Kashmir, there are a lot of times that Shopian is cut off, Srinagar is cut off, and not the entire region. So that is, and again, like, to figure out these shutdowns, it's extremely difficult at times, because people don't really understand that a shutdown has happened. There is, of course, no sort of government announcement that, oh, we're going to shut down the internet. You might like just take care of your things. That never happens. So what we do is we greatly rely on local sources. We have a large community of people on the ground who report to us if there is a shutdown or there is a possibility of shutdown. We rely on social media because somebody or the other is always reporting these shutdowns. It's almost like a 24-hour job that you keep on the lookout, that, oh, has there been a shutdown? And in Kashmir recently, there have been so many shutdowns. I think there's in middle, there was an internet shutdown, almost like even 2G was shut down short almost every second day. Then we rely on the tracker. Of course, there are people who email us. We always look at local news sources because those are the most accurate. There's a very less chance that the national media will be reporting a shutdown. So I think I hope I've answered the question. That this is
I
the way
have
that,
two follow-up questions for you, Radhika.
yeah.
One, with the last statement, you said that national media generally does not report a shutdown. Why is that? And the second one um, is it right to say that India right now has the highest number of internet shutdowns in a democracy in terms of the tracking?
Right. So the first question, the reason why a national media doesn't report a shutdown is because they're too minor. So India has, I mean, I think it has thousands of districts. So if internet is shut in one district, it's like it's not big enough for a national media to report it. But like, for example, if an entire state is shut down, then it is. If so, in Delhi there was a shutdown and there was a wide reportage of it. So it's you understand that it's an urban area. There are so many people who are there. There is a lot of understanding of what a shutdown is. So it's easy to report there. It's, of course, it also makes for a good news story that, oh, internet was shut in Delhi. But it will not be a good story that, internet was shut down in some remote village in West Bengal. Recently, there was a big internet shutdown in Hooghly district in West Bengal, which was a 6-day long shutdown, right? It took, like, somebody from the ground told us that there is an internet shutdown, and it took us a really long time to see if any media has reported. And it was a 6-day long shutdown during a pandemic, which also makes it very difficult to seek judicial recourse for it. I mean, we were able to file a petition in the Calcutta High Court in time, but mostly because these shutdowns, they get reported later, it just gets impossible to do that. Your second, sorry, what was the second question?
That India being a democracy that has the largest
Right.
number of internet shutdowns.
Yes, a number of newspapers have reported that, and definitely, like, except I think Rakhine and Chin State in Myanmar, Kashmir is the longest continuous shutdown that a democracy has ever had.
I now want to go over to a very important segment of the report where you talk about internet governance in a militarized state. Of course, for Kashmir, the curfews, the shutdowns are not new. There's a long history to it. Can you walk us through that and how that works in relationship to the current digital shutdowns?
So as you said, Kashmir has witnessed a lot of shutdowns. There have been curfews and lockdowns, and it is a militarized state, so things do become different when we analyze these things. So, so in terms of understanding how the infrastructure works, I think there are two things to it. Firstly, there is the idea of surveillance, and secondly, the idea of what is also written in the report as the perception management, right? So after 5th August, what happened was an immediate shutdown in terms of communication and movement. And what we realized was that there was a deliberate effort to sort of prevent any information from ground from going out. So that is one way in which the state sort of functions to ensure that in a militarized state, given the political history, given the current political scenario, things remain in control and as they want. So one is that where you have an internet shutdown sort of helps in ensuring that that perception management is maintained. And even when you see all the information that was coming out from Kashmir was mostly being either reported by international news channels or being reported, or when you had people on ground from, as in Delhi journalists, they were all giving a totally different picture. So in that perception management, and it plays a key role because you don't have people telling you uh, from each second what is happening as it is happening. So one, you can control that, and secondly, in the longer run, it helps you maintain surveillance, and it helps you set up an infrastructure where you're able to control the kind of information that comes out of Kashmir or even what happens in Kashmir. So for example, just in terms of after 2G was restored in January till I think 3rd March, there was a whitelist on certain websites. Social media wasn't allowed, and what happened was that there were people started using VPNs, and that's how they started accessing social media. And in order to curb that, you had several open FIRs where people who were using VPNs were criminalized. So that's one way in which you sort of ensure surveillance. And then further in terms of how journalists are criminalized in Kashmir, and now this has been going on, and just in terms of how political dissent is being crushed completely. So that internet plays a key role in ensuring that dissent is crushed, and criminalization is easier.
Radhika, I know that FSL has done a lot of work in terms of documenting how Section 144 is weaponized. Can you walk us through what Section 144 is and walk us through how it's being weaponized, especially with these shutdowns?
Right. So Section 144 is a very general provision. This general provision, it's basically like, you can't, like, more than 4 people cannot collect in a place because there might be an emergency, there might be a threat to law and order. So before 2017, Section 144 was widely used to impose internet shutdowns. In August 2017, there were this notification of telecom suspension rules. So these rules are the ones that are supposedly used to impose internet shutdowns. And again, because Section 144 is a general provision and telecom suspension rules are more particular, it is, and even in Anuradha Bhasin it was retaliated that you have to use telecom suspension rules because that's a proper procedure. I mean, of course they also suffer from problems. The provisions do have its own set of problems, but at the same time they're still better than 144 because then there is a review committee, there is a proper procedure. But even after that, there have been instances where Section 144 has been used repeatedly to impose shutdowns. During CAA protests, I'm not sure what the exact number is because we still don't have the orders even after filing a number of RTIs. But there have been a number of internet suspensions which have happened using Section 144. Even in the Hooghly district case that I was telling you about, that was also imposed using 144. So, I mean, it is definitely problematic to use that section when you have a particular provision in place.
Misbah, can you talk
Even
to us?
in Kashmir,
Yeah, sorry, I
sorry,
didn't mean to.
so just to add, even in Kashmir, after the Anuradha Bhasin judgment, there were 17 government orders of continuous 2G internet services, and around 70 temporary suspension orders. And if you look at those orders, they're almost identical. The things that are written in those orders in terms of rumors being circulated, or in terms of public order problems. So those are almost identical, and these are 70 government orders, 17 government orders, and they're almost identical in nature.
Mishpa, I have a follow-up question for you. In case of Kashmir, the report also talks about this in the sense that there seems to be almost no accountability. Once you talked about perception management, but there's also the sense that, again, as you rightly pointed out, since the Anuradha Bashim judgment, the case, you still have 17 government orders. How does one document the lack of this accountability? Because that's also, I felt, was an important contribution of this report.
So we had a government, we had a Supreme Court judgment with us, which sort of laid a framework for us and told us that internet, that the right to access internet is in India is to be understood within this framework, which was extremely narrow. And when we did our field work, we realized that this, of course, extends to a lot more, and we realized that that just in terms of the costs of internet shutdown were extremely high, and this was followed by another petition that was filed in court in April, which was by the Foundation of Media Professionals, which again reiterated the cost of the human impact of the internet shutdown, where you had affidavits by teachers, lawyers, doctors, writing exactly how difficult it was for them to work. And this was also during the COVID lockdown. So documenting each and every problem that they faced. And despite that, the court did not really come to rescue, or did not provide much of a redressal for those who had filed a petition. And all they said was that, you have a review committee. And I think what was reiterated at all points of time was that national security is something that isn't up for judicial review, and the matter of national security and would fall with exclusively with the government, and that's when they make the decision. So when you have a court accepting that argument, and when you have a completely different narrative coming from the state, documentation becomes extremely important, because that's the only way you can sort of put it out to the world that things are not as they seem. And of course counter the normalcy narrative that became so it was repeated so often after 5th August. So it became extremely important to document that, and to just put it out there to say that you have certain rights that each and every individual within your international human rights framework, not just within the Indian Constitution, but as the human rights in the international human rights framework, there are certain rights that each and every individual is guaranteed, and just how all those rights are taken away from Kashmiris when you have such a restriction.
I know we've already mentioned the Anuradha Basam judgment quite a few times. Radhika, can you perhaps lay out for those of our audience who do not know what the judgment is, what is this case,
Right.
what was being sought, and then we can kind of perhaps follow it up with the implications for Kashmir.
Definitely. So around, I think, beginning of August in 2019, Kashmir suddenly saw a lot of deployment of police forces, of security forces, as well as, like Amarnath Yatra was suddenly, like pilgrims were supposed to, and there's a security threat, and I think 4th August. 2019, towards the end of the day, mobile and broadband lines were completely snapped. So there was no landline, there was no there was no SMS, there was no mobile, there was nothing. So one interesting thing to note here is that even though Kashmir has had a number of shutdowns, Kashmir has I think the total number of shutdowns in Kashmir till date is 227. So one interesting thing to note here is that before that, that they have something called a corporate line. These corporate lines were available for businesses, for newspapers, etc. Generally, even when the internet was shut down. But this time around, there was government officers did not have internet. Nothing had internet throughout. So imagine like an entire state just blacked out. Now, after that, I think Anuradha Baseen, who was the editor of Kashmir Times, that's a newspaper based in Jammu, and we have a very interesting interview with her up on our website. People should definitely go and have a look to understand more about it. Filed a petition in the Supreme Court saying that like an internet block impacted her right to her trade and profession. Then it was followed by Ghulam Nabi Azad, and there were a number of petitioners that were in the case. So this case went on. So you can imagine it almost. She moved the petition on 10th August 2019, and the judgment came on 10th January. 2020. So you can imagine almost a period of 5 to 6 months that were there. There were contentions that happened. The government said that of course now there is nothing above national security. Interesting thing here was that the court also asked that, can you restrict a couple of websites and let other websites work if you feel, because again, social media is a small part of internet. There is so much more to the internet than just social media. So can you just restrict down on social media and let other things work? But Tushar Mehta, the counsel for the government at that time, said that no, it's not possible. We don't have the technology for that. But this is what went on later. There were whitelisting of websites for a month and a half between January and March. Between that there were later January and 4th March, I guess, there were whitelisting of websites where there were only certain the government was opening certain websites upon 2G, and of course these websites were also not working because these websites are not equipped for 2G. Then there are these websites take you somewhere else. Then the judgment was interesting. Like it looked like when I remember we were sitting in office and the judgment came, and our first reaction was, oh, it's a good judgment. And then when we got to reading it, my personal opinion was that it's a lot of academic thought that, oh, we shouldn't do this, but national security. And there were a lot of these arguments. So but the government did lay the court did lay out that the orders need to be in public domain. The state has to publish all orders in force under section 144 of CRPC, as well as suspension of telecom services. There is a constitutional protection is to be given to freedom of speech and expression practiced over the medium of internet under 191A and 191G. Under Telecom Suspension Rules 2017, suspending internet indefinitely is impermissible. The principle of proportionality must be adhered to. The orders should be available in the public domain so that they're susceptible to judicial review. The review committee, which is formed under Rule 2.5 Telecom Suspension Rules, must conduct a periodic review after every 7 working days, which has, I think, become like 2 weeks. Like I see orders every 2 weeks now, and sometimes 3 weeks also. So state and concerned authorities in places where internet cannot be restored immediately should consider allowing government websites. This has, I think, started happening after the FMP petition. FMP petition also brought this up. The court said the power under section 144 of, so this is a really important part. The court said that the power under 144 of CRPC is remedial as well as preventive and can be exercised when there is a present danger as well as an apprehension of danger. The danger should be in nature of emergency. So, you just cannot arbitrarily impose 144 whenever and however. The respondent state has to continuously review. One interesting thing that I read on freedom of press was that like I'm quoting this verbatim. In view of these facts and considering that the aforesaid petitioner, which is Anuradha Bhasin, has now resumed publication, we do not deem it fit to indulge more in the issue than to state that responsible governments are required to respect the freedom of press at all times. Journalists are to be accommodated in reporting, and there is no justification for allowing a sword of Damocles to hang over the press indefinitely. I mean, I think I'll leave it to Misbah to discuss what the judgment means, but we can clearly see that it's not as good as it sounded.
Mishpa, I also have an audience question towards you. Perhaps you could also, I think it would be good to kind of include this the answer for this question along with your response to the Anuradha Bhasin case. One of the questions that I have with me is, what is the effect of consistently using? What is the effect? I have to rephrase. What is the effect of consistently using the word national security to justify incarcerating 8 million Kashmiris? So I think this kind of goes into the idea of how national security is used as a blanket statement to justify all kinds of egregious acts in Kashmir. Perhaps if you could talk about your response to the Anuradha Bhasin case, and also this idea of national security as a blanket response to everything.
As Radhika pointed out, the Anuradha Bhasin judgment was, of course, celebrated in India, but we were extremely skeptical of the judgment. So what it did was it said that right to access the internet is not a fundamental right in itself, but it is a fundamental, but it is an important right insofar as it is important for you to access other fundamental rights exclusively, as mentioned by the judgment, was Article 19.1A, which is the freedom of speech and expression, and Article 19.1G, which is your right to freedom of trade and profession and occupation. So just in terms of accessing these two fundamental rights of the Constitution, the court said that it's important that access to internet is given. But the rider, of course, in this was that in terms of national security problems, or what is also listed as an exception to Article 19 in the Indian Constitution, is that there can be restrictions on fundamental rights given certain criteria. And that's where Kashmir fits in, or that's where Kashmir has always been that exception, where we're given what is referred to as national security concerns or anti-national activities, or referred to as public order issues. This is where Kashmir falls in, and each and every time there is a question of a fundamental right or any or about a progressive judgment that guarantees rights, Kashmir unfortunately falls within that exception to which this would not be guaranteed, which is exactly what happened after Narada Basin as well. So in 2019, before 5th August, there were 55 internet shutdowns in Kashmir. But after Narada Basin, which was in the beginning of January, you had 70 temporary suspension orders and 17 2G continuation orders. But these were orders that were published instead of what wasn't happening before, that these orders weren't getting published. So the only thing that changed in effect or in nature was that these orders were now public and could be challenged in court. But the relief was not there because there was no internet that was given to the people. Now, in terms of what happened immediately, was there were certain changes by the government. So, for example, immediately after Radha Basin, 2G internet was allowed in Kashmir, but there were certain websites that were whitelisted, and you could only access those websites. And Radhika, as Radhika pointed out, it absolutely made no sense because this is an important report that we referred to by Pratik Vagare and Rohini Lakshani from Media Nama, who did an analysis on what exactly it meant to sort of whitelist certain websites. So there were around 301 websites that were whitelisted, out of which only 126 were effectively working. And what does effectively working even mean? You had websites like Netflix, Hotstar, and Amazon Prime working, which are really possible to use on 2G. Then you had websites like Zomato, which actually doesn't even work in Kashmir. Then you had websites like Flipkart, but you did have websites like Snapdeal, which was clear to show that there wasn't really an application of mind, as you say, in deciding what was to be allowed and what wasn't to be allowed. And even in terms of allowing essential websites, say for banking services or finance services, which was something that was prevented before 2G was made accessible. So you had, say, for example, one website which was ICICI.com, which was whitelisted. But when you click on a subdomain within that website, that wasn't whitelisted. So you couldn't access that, which meant essentially that even within that whitelisting of websites, there wasn't much that you could do. And then you had people using VPNs, and then after that, in March, it was when social media was allowed to be used. But even now, we are only using 2G in Kashmir, and you have only 2 districts where they've allowed 4G, saying that this is on trial basis. And this was after months of litigation where there was contempt filing of another Basim, where a review committee was informed, and then you had another judgment where the court decided that the group of people that were actually passing these internet suspension orders will form a committee and decide whether internet should be restored or not. So again, this became the system operated in a way where it became clear that the right to access internet in terms of what it should be, as an independent right, was definitely not something that was going to be available to Kashmiris. But even in terms of the framework given by Narada Basin judgment, that also wasn't something that Kashmiris could access. And talking about national security, as the question was, I think that is the thing, right? National security is the framework in which Kashmir operates. And what is this national security concern? What does it mean? And how it's used. It's not the first time that national security is being used. You have exceptional laws in Kashmir, like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. You have the Public Safety Act. You have a large number of political detainees in Kashmir. So all of that is reflective of the national security problem that the state portrays that there is, and how dissent is sort of used. Dissent is crushed using that national security argument.
I kind of want to go into the very important idea that the report flags, the idea of digital apartheid. And I want to do it through this case. In September 2019, just as the Anuradha Bashim the case was in the courts, you also had another judgment. The High Court of Kerala in Fahima Shireen and the state of Kerala upheld the right to access of internet as a fundamental right. Right. And I was wondering, Radhika, can you kind of walk us through what Fahima Shari means, and then how it kind of very specifically draws the difference between India and Kashmir and the digital apartheid that kind of gets implemented as a result of this. I can only call it dissonance at this point in time, if not anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So Fahima Shaheen was the Shahid it was a case in which SFLC would impede us. What had happened was there was this girl, she was not allowed to use the internet between, I think, 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning in a college hostel. And this rule was, of course, discriminatory towards boys, it was because it was only implemented in girls hostel. So and later she was also suspended. So we pleaded, we said that you can't, like, because internet is an important medium for education, you can't just tell a student that she can't use the internet, she can't use a mobile phone. And I think in a judgment by Justice PV Usha, it was a single judge bench, she did say it was upheld that that right to internet access is a fundamental right uh, under like Article 21 of the Constitution. uh, to quote, the enforcement of discipline shall not be by blocking the ways and means of the students to acquire knowledge. They should be left to choose the time for using mobile phones. The only restriction that can be imposed should not to cause disturbance to any students. It is pertinent to note that rules and regulations require reforms to cope up with the advancement of technology and the importance of modern technology to day-to-day life, and it should be left to the students to choose the time of using mobile phone. I mean, we all know that we're living through a pandemic right now. All of us are online. All of our education is happening online. All of our work is happening online. And in that time, you can't expect students to not use mobile phones. Of course, like, technology is looked at as disruptive. And that is exactly what is happening in the case of Kashmir. They think that, technology is going to enable them to have democratic rights. And like, it's surprising that one part of the country, uh you have like really progressive judgments, as right to internet access is a fundamental right, and on one part of the country, there is no internet for like more than a year. And more than that, I mean, even in the worst of the cases, it could have been excusable. I mean, I don't think it's excusable, but still, you could still consider it if there was not a pandemic, right? As somebody who's spoken to a number of people in the region across, like, before the pandemic, when the shutdown started, now I feel that you have, like, internet is not just, it's not a luxury, it's a need. You need internet for every single little thing. And it's not that, oh, if you don't have a microwave, go, like, you can use a gas burner, because then there is no concept of now, with the advancement in technology, there is only microwave to be used. And when you stop people from using microwave, giving the analogy that, go use a gas burner, it doesn't work that way anymore. You cannot. It's absolutely terrifying to think of the fact that there's so many students who could have learned so much. There are so many students who could have finished their education. There are so many students who had these scholarships. Like, I had this I spoke to this person who used to tell me that, when there was no internet, people lost their fellowships, people lost their scholarships. Imagine people losing out on years of education because there is no internet. How are you supposed to go to a facilitation center? There are 10th board exams results which are announced, 12th, and is there any other way to check them except the internet? How are you supposed to stand in line for hours in front of facilitation centers to check your results? Right? Internet is no longer, it's a necessity, and it's really high time that India recognizes it, that it's just, it's not a luxury anymore.
Misbah, do you have any response follow up to that, or should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, so just in terms of education, we in our report we have referred to the judgment of Fahima Shireen, where we talk about how right to education as a fundamental right was also understood as right to access the internet, and we've also used a UNGA resolution which talks about access to education, affordable education. All is now moving towards a digital framework where now internet is extremely important in all of this. And And just in terms of what this has had, what effects has had on Kashmiris, right? The FMG petition had a number of teachers write that students weren't able to get proper education, they weren't able to access the internet, and even if they were able to access 2G internet, they weren't really being able to have online classes because it just wasn't possible on 2G. And despite making those submissions, the submissions made by the state was that 2G is working, but working enough for students to access it, but not enough for it to be misused, which was a very circular argument used in the whole petition anyway. But the idea that now it has been over a year that students have not gone to school, and only a part of it is because of the COVID lockdown, but most of it is also because there was a complete overhaul in this state of affairs in Kashmir after 5th August. So students haven't been to school, college students haven't gone to colleges, and even after the COVID lockdown, a lot of Kashmiri students who had gone outside, which is generally because of how things are in Kashmir. A lot of parents do send their children outside to study, and after the COVID lockdown, a lot of them went back. So what that meant was that while everyone else was coping with online classes or online exams or making online submissions, during the lockdown for Kashmiris, this just wasn't possible on unlimited internet access, and even I mean, for students and otherwise university students, but also for research scholars, as Radhika pointed out, you're losing scholarships, you're losing admissions, you're not able to do your research because that whole infrastructure of research is built on the internet. You don't, and with the COVID lockdown, you're not going to libraries anyway. So how do you access information? And in that sense, how the education system sort of broke down in Kashmir.
One of the things that I really wanted to talk about is how, while this blockade has completely annihilated the economic, social life of Kashmiris, what's interesting is that organizations like Reliance's Geo actually used this shutdown to actually grow their business. Can you kind of talk to us about what happened with the fiber cables, TRAI, and other things that the report talks about?
One of the applications or websites that you could access in the whitelisting order was GeoChat, and that was an exception made to all the other available forms of communication. So that was one exception made to Geo, but also even after that. What you had was that immediately after there was a shutdown, there was a partial restoration, and firstly, there was a restoration of landline. And I mean, I don't know who uses landline anymore, but in Kashmir, it's so important because there's a constant shutdown of internet and communication. So landlines is something that do works. And there were people who were installing this. There was a rising people installing landline connections, and the ones that do mostly work were geo connections and BSNL connections. And even after that, when fixed line connections were being made available, you had geo that was sort of dominating the market, and people were sort of compelled to buy that because it was, I mean, economically it was being made available at cheaper rates, and it was also generally otherwise also available more easily as compared to others. And it was also working better than anything else. So that whole infrastructure was created in a way where you clearly uh, uh, had someone being favored over others.
I have an audience question coming in. The question talks about. The question says, despite despite the severe nature of the shutdown, um, the Indian media narrative continues to justify that everything is normal in Kashmir. Similarly, we see that the coverage about Kashmir in international news is also increasingly coming down. Given that the violations continue to go on, and given that the media coverage is almost non existent, what is the next step? This seems like a very ominous question.
Can I go? Yeah.
Yeah, I would, Radhika, Mishpadia, I would like to kind of hear what you guys think, given that. Sorry, I didn't cut you.
I
Please go ahead.
sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I think the role of civil society here is extremely important, of independent researchers, of reports like JKSS report that Mishra was a part of. They're extremely important. I mean, the way that we have seen it, and we've been tracking shutdowns for a really long time, that it was only during the CAA protests that internet shutdowns were actually given uh, the coverage that they deserve, to to for people to understand what is the problem with them. A lot of people don't understand the problem with shutdowns. We live in a country, India is a country where like people don't really understand basic issues. They don't understand that. And I've spoken to people over a period of time where they're like, oh, it's okay, they've cut off the internet, it's for the good of the country, internet will come back. So it's something. There is no documentation of these shutdowns, there is no awareness about these shutdowns. It is very important for us, for people of the region, people who are allies with the region, with the people of the region, to spread awareness about it, to understand what, like, it's very important to understand why cutting of the internet is dehumanizing, why cutting of the internet is like a democratic violation. uh, that's where organizations like yours, like Polis, like SFLC, like JKSS, and a number of other civil society organizations, CIS, IFF, FMP, all of them come together, because we constantly, like, this is a battle that we have to fight every day, and this is something that should not go cold. So even if the media is not doing a job, civil society should step up and do it. I mean, civil society is stepping up and doing it, but citizens should do it. People on Twitter should do it. People on Instagram should do it. We should make posts. We should we should take up, because again, media, I mean, I don't really want to say anything about Indian media anymore, but all left organizations should do it. So it's, I think, the burden of protecting our democracy, protecting our rights, is on our shoulders now.
Misbah?
Yeah. So I think this is also something that we didn't discuss when we were talking about the digital apartheid, right? I think the reason that we did choose to talk about this digital siege in terms of a digital apartheid was because we wanted to um, communicate the idea of a legalized and a systematic and a structural form of discrimination that Kashmiris face, and how they are subjected to a collective punishment, which is something that Kashmiris are have been subjected to for a long time now. And this is where it becomes important to note that the internet shutdown is unprecedented in the sense that it's been going on for a really long time, and it happened after 5th August, which is the constitutional relationship of Kashmir with India. But at the same time, the sort of systematic and legalized discrimination that Kashmiris have been facing is not new. And in terms of the media coverage that Kashmir does get, again, it wasn't getting that sort of coverage before, and now it, in the sense that you have independent organizations that are sort of working to amplify voices of Kashmiris, but again, this isn't something that has happened post 5th August, but is something that has been in existence for a long time now. And I think, as is the case with our report as well, it appeals to a larger general international community, saying that there are certain rights, that Kashmir is a place of conflict. It is important for peace. It is for international peace and security. It is something that everybody should be aware of and should take note of, and should also get into and recognize the kind of violations that are taking place in Kashmir, because it is something that everyone should be concerned about, and which is why, if voices that sort of put that information forward are coming from Kashmir, they should be amplified. And if, if Indian media channels or if Indian groups are not doing it, I mean, it's just part of the systemic of oppression, I guess.
We are coming to the last part of the segment. So I think another thing for us to also flag now is that while we're talking about the digital apartheid, the problems did not start in August 4th or 5th. Kashmir has a long history of militarization, long history of depriving its people of the right to freedom, long history of egregious violations of human rights, and not to mention that the UN specifically called it a collective punishment. So I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that this is not something new. One of the things that I really wanted to think through is the report very specifically talks about how internet denial is also a counterinsurgency policy. Mishpa, can you talk to us about what that means and walk us through the idea of internet denial as a counterinsurgency policy?
So, there's this thing called doctrine of suppression, conventional warfare, where you work towards breaking the will of the people and you sort of change the narrative, change the discourse on ground. And one of the ways in which you do this is that you push people to the point where you don't allow for any sort of freedom of speech or expression or any other freedom where you completely cripple any form of dissent or any other opinion to exist. And this is what has been happening in Kashmir, and how the digital siege is only a part of that counterinsurgency policy. Where I mean, over the years, people have taken to different forms of social media to sort of put it out there to the world what is happening in Kashmir. So you have real time information going out. You have images, you have videos, you have articles that people are writing, and all of that is going out real time by the people of Kashmir, which is something that is happening a lot more than it happened before. So obviously it becomes extremely important for the state to think that in order to ensure that that information isn't going out, and in order to ensure that that sort of opinion doesn't exist, you have to break the source, break the medium, and the medium becomes the internet. And it is one of the ways in which you collectively sort of punish the people for largely supporting for having a certain political opinion, for supporting a political opinion, for dissenting to the state, and that's how you do it. You collectively punish it. I mean, if you were to even look at the numbers that the state gives, you have 100 to 200 militants, which is something that the state says in Kashmir. So if you have such a small number of militants, and then when you talk about terrorist activities, public order issues, then how is it that you think that it is right to take away the fundamental rights of each and every Kashmiri? And that is around 1.2 million people, as opposed to 100 to 200 militants. It is extremely disproportionate, and it is a form of collective punishment, which falls under the larger counterinsurgency project.
Radhika, do you want to add to this?
I think Misbah covered it perfectly. So
I think we have a bunch of questions, so I'm just going to kind of put these questions to you from our audience. One of the questions that we keep getting is, what are the next steps? The report, okay, I have to rephrase it. Given that the report is now out and many organizations have been documenting this, what are the next steps?
I think, as I said earlier, that the next steps definitely is doing more litigation. I mean, it's more documentation. It's more, it's more documentation of experiences. It's more documentation of shutdowns. Like surprisingly, there was a question put up by Rahul Gandhi in the parliament, that do you think that there are that the government of India maintains the data of the number of internet shutdowns that are there, and the government said that no, there isn't. So I mean, documenting them, keeping a track of them is definitely the first step. Civil society coalitions is the next step. Legal organizations need to come together. There needs to be aggressive litigation. There needs to be aggressive, people raising their voices. Movements. I think the first step is just to make people aware of shutdowns. And trust me when I say this, that there are still people who don't know, who don't understand that, that there are problems with shutdown and what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir. Half of the population of India still has no idea, even like, and I'm just talking about the internet shutdowns part. So what we are trying to do now is we're trying to translate voices. We're trying to translate. We're getting we're trying to make content which people people don't necessarily have to be intellectuals to understand it, but everyday person can understand it and understand what the problem with shutdowns is. Because I really feel that unless and until you go out and say what the problem is, you're not going to find, there will not be a solution. So people just need to talk about shutdowns, people just need to talk about internet rights, people need to talk about privacy. These are things that unless and until are spoken about, uh, nothing can move in any direction.
Misbah, do you have a response?
Yeah, so in terms of specifically talking about the report first, I think there are two things that can come out of such a documentation, right? One is the idea that what does it mean to have digital rights? What does it mean to think of right to access the internet as an important and a fundamental right? I think this report sort of um, aimed and goal was the goal to so document that why access to internet should be seen as a fundamental and important right, because it's tied to so many other things, so many other fundamental rights. So one is just in terms of right to access the internet or digital rights, but also secondly in terms of the effect it has on Kashmiris specifically, and given the political history of Kashmir, given the political context, why taking away internet rights are also is part of the larger the larger framework in which Kashmir plays out. And what can happen from now is that I mean, firstly, it's of course important to document. I think documentation is extremely important, and people from Kashmir have been documenting. And now it's important to amplify those voices, to put it out there, not just within India but also around the world, to ensure that people know about the human cost of these policy decisions, and also how within the larger international humanitarian law framework or within the international law framework, how these are violations of that of those rights.
Misbah and Radhika, thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to flag that we will be linking the report to on all our social media pages. Please do read. The report also has an important timeline that maps what happens. Second, we'll also be linking the work that FSLC does, which in terms of internet shutdowns and their work. But more importantly, I would also urge all of you to go back and read listen to another conversation with Mona Bana Tazia that we did a few weeks ago, which actually talks about the domicile change and what that means for demographic threat for the Kashmiri population. And again, Radhika and Mishpa, thank you so much. I'm absolutely impressed and so glad to learn from both of you. And just as we talk about Shudha Bharadwaj today as a lawyer and a legal representative and a researcher being incarcerated, I'm absolutely thrilled that I'm having conversations with two young lawyers and researchers. Thank you for your work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suchitra. Thanks, Polis. See you
Thank
around, Misbah.
Thank you. And of course,